Pope John Paul II, the head of the Roman Catholic Church for a quarter century, has died in Rome. Tonight, John Paul's life, his legacy, the outpouring of emotion around the world, and the future of the Roman Catholic Church.
The death of Pope John Paul II. This is a special edition of NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams.
Good evening. An incredible journey, an extraordinary life has come to an end. Pope John Paul II died today. The announcement came shortly after 2:30 this afternoon Eastern Time, when the Vatican announced that after 26 years, 5 months and 16 days, this extraordinary papacy has come to an end. In the end, his body was ravaged by age, by Parkinson's disease. He was breathing and eating through tubes, and it was kidney and heart failure that took his life. He died his own way, at home and on his own terms. He led the Catholic Church much the same way. Tonight, to begin our extensive coverage, NBC News correspondent Keith Miller, who has covered so much of this papacy, with us tonight from the Vatican. Keith, good evening.
Brian, the rituals surrounding the death of a pope have now been completed. Pope John Paul II's personal ring with his insignia on it has been broken, indicating that his papacy has come to a close. The Vatican apartments, where the windows are still aglow tonight, are being sealed with lead, not to be reopened until the election of the next pope. The death of Pope John Paul II did not come as a surprise, but it certainly had the power to shock. The square was already filling with people for a recital of the Rosary when Archbishop Leonardo Sandri got the word that Pope John Paul II had died.
Carissimi fratelli e sorelle,
he interrupted the prayer service to deliver the news.
Il nostro amatissimo Santo Padre Giovanni
Our Holy Father, John Paul, he said, has returned to the house of the Father. The vast crowd fell silent. The lights in the papal apartment still glowed, but it was no longer the home of John Paul. The international media got word by email that the Pope had passed away at 9:37. He died of heart and kidney failure. It was the bells from St. Peter's Basilica that signaled bodies expected to be lying in state in St. Peter's Basilica by Monday afternoon. Presidents, prime ministers, and 100,000 people or more are expected to descend on the Vatican to pay their final respects. Brian?
Keith Miller at the Vatican for us tonight. Keith, thank you. NBC's Ann Thompson joins us now with more from the faithful who have gathered in St. Peter's Square tonight. Ann?
Good evening, Brian. What was striking were the sounds and the deep emotions of the people in the square. When the end came, it was as everyone expected, but almost no one wanted.
Mondo è tornato alla casa del Padre.
Hearing the news, the crowd in St. Peter's applauded. An Italian sign of respect for the Polish Pope. Thousands of eyes turned up to the still-lit papal apartment as tears came down. The grief not bound by gender or age or faith. For a man who captured many hearts, even though his ideas and positions did not always capture minds. Far from his home in New Orleans, Brother Tan Nguyen mourned.
There's certainly a sorrow, a sadness that comes from it, from someone.
And music will be heard again in the square tomorrow at a special mass to honor Pope John Paul II, who tonight mourners called the People's Pope. Brian?
Ann Thompson at the Vatican tonight. Ann, thanks. And crowds gathers as well tonight in the land where this Pope is an icon, his native Poland. NBC's Kelly O'Donnell is with us from Krakow tonight. Kelly, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. Tonight, the Polish people give to John Paul something they say he always offered them: simple devotion. So they light candles. Some fall to their knees. A nation grieves, and so do some of John Paul's oldest friends. For 86-year-old stands former President Lech Wałęsa, who spoke of the Pope saying that communism would not have ended the way it did had John Paul not been such an unstoppable force for change. Brian?
Kelly O'Donnell in Krakow for us tonight. Kelly, thank you. And now here in the U.S., where Catholics are gathering for prayers, NBC's Ron Allen is at the Cathedral of Our Lady of the Angels in Los Angeles, home of this nation's largest archdiocese. Ron, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. In Los Angeles, worshipers are beginning to arrive for a special mass. Cardinal Roger Mahony has already left and in fact arrived in Rome, we understand. As America's 64 million Catholics and others who were touched by a pope who became an icon in this country gather to mourn his passing.
America Second is now gathered into the arms of the Heavenly Father.
Across America, deep mourning for a pope who visited 7 times.
And legacy. His was a life of service and dedication to the Catholic Church and the world. John Paul II lived to bring people to faith and bring them together. Now a look back at the exceptional life and legacy of Pope John Paul II. It was October 1978, and it wasn't that long after the ceremonial puff of white smoke was visible before people saw the first signs
Habemus Papam
that this new pope would be so very different. His charisma was palpable, his personality engaging, and his touch was that of the common people in his church. He went on to become the first pope of the media age. Only 2 popes served longer than John Paul II. It had been almost 500 years since the last non-Italian pope, before it was announced that Cardinal Karol Wojtyła of Krakow, Poland, would be known by the title Pope John Paul II.
We are witnessing global acceleration of that quest for freedom.
He saw himself as a contemporary successor to St. Peter, and his mission as he saw it was to travel, leave the confines of the Vatican and minister to the flock. And he did. He crisscrossed 6 continents, visiting more than 130 countries. He gave new meaning to the jet age and traveled by air, the equivalent of 28 trips around the globe. No single individual on the planet has been seen by more people in person.
I come as a friend of America.
His life before becoming pope was an indicator to all that he would be a different kind of leader for the 1.1 billion Catholics around the world. Young Karol Wojtyła had been a factory worker, a playwright, an actor. He was a superb athlete, an avid skier. He had seen firsthand as a young man the brutalization of Poland, the scourge of Nazism, and later communism, and it shaped his ideology, later his papacy.
He knew Poland so well, and they trusted him. They were willing to come out and put their lives on the line.
His leadership helped trigger a chain of events that would eventually lead to the fall of communism in the Soviet Union.
He knew the vulnerability of communism from the inside. He understood that the emperor had less clothes than the emperor imagined, or even that many statesmen around the world imagined.
John Paul II became the model of pope as statesman. He was a constant advocate for peace, confronting world leaders and 5 U.S. presidents, including the current president, over the mission to topple Saddam Hussein, which the Pope saw as an elective war that lacked moral justification.
John Paul II became a kind of universal moral reference point, a great defender of the human rights of everyone.
He worried about what he saw as excesses of materialism in the prosperous West.
It is we who must choose between evil and good.
He worried, too, that newly liberated countries of Eastern Europe were following suit, turning away from religion.
The faithful are constantly challenged by consumerism and a pleasure-seeking mentality.
But he never ever watered down traditional Catholic doctrine as a way of trying to reach the disaffected. On his core beliefs, he would not waver. Those who hoped for change on issues like celibacy, contraception, and the ordination of women as priests would be profoundly disappointed. And yet the Pope's message of faith in the face of a sometimes overwhelming popular culture resonated with the world's youth.
You are young, and the Pope is old.
Something about him seemed to have a magical hold on them.
He held the bar of expectation high and said to young people, don't ever settle for anything less than the spiritual and moral greatness of which, with God's grace, you are capable.
But even as he slowed down, as his vitality wavered, he remained one of the world's most popular leaders. The waning years of his papacy were filled with both religious and personal challenges, like the sexual abuse scandals that roiled the church in America and Europe.
The body of Christ.
Let us build a new future in which there will be no more anti-Jewish feeling among Christians and anti-Christian feeling among Jews.
He reached out to Jews, Muslims, and Orthodox Christians to try to bridge the East-West divide, and results were mixed, but he remained indomitable. His suffering was sad to watch. Parkinson's, debilitating arthritis, and the many after effects of the assassination attempt against him in 1981. Many Westerners openly wondered if the Pope was receiving the best possible medical care. But he truly believed that suffering was part of life's journey. And even that connected him further with so many older Catholics. He appointed all but 3 of the cardinals who will now choose the man to replace him. He canonized more saints than all of his predecessors combined. His legacy is unshakable. Those of us who were present on the day he commemorated the 25th anniversary of his papacy in October 2003 saw that he appeared to be saying goodbye in his way to a world profoundly changed, in part because he lived in it. When we come back, the reaction tonight from President Bush. The President has ordered flags over the White House flown at half-staff. Today, he called this Pope an inspiration. From the White House tonight, NBC's David Gregory with the story of this president and this Pope.
The President and First Lady marked the Pope's death tonight by attending Mass at St. Matthew's Cathedral in Washington. Earlier, Mr. Bush spoke to the nation.
John Paul's witness reminded us of our obligation to build a culture of life in which the strong protect the weak. And during the Pope's final years, his witness was made even more powerful by his daily courage in the face of illness and great suffering.
It gives me great pleasure to welcome you on your first visit.
President Bush met Pope John Paul II on 3 separate occasions during his first term. During each meeting, they discussed sensitive matters, the issue of stem cell research, abuse in the Catholic Church, and during their final meeting last year, the Holy Father repeated his opposition to the war in Iraq. Tonight at the White House and at public buildings around the country, the U.S. flag flies at half-staff.
And tonight, White House sources say the president will attend the Pope's funeral. Officials here are simply waiting for an official invitation. Brian.
David Gregory at the White House tonight, thanks. As millions mourn the Pope's loss, there is this question tonight. What happens now? Who is running the Vatican and leading the Roman Catholic Church? Here with that, NBC's Jim Maceda.
II enacted a special NBC News, the Vatican.
There is other news tonight from Iraq, where insurgents attacked the infamous Abu Ghraib prison in western Baghdad. It happened at sundown. 60 insurgents opened fire with rocket-propelled grenades and mortars and set off 2 car bombs. 2 U.S. so-called quick reaction forces and 3 Apache helicopters were called in, and an intense battle raged then for 45 minutes. 20 American service members and 12 prisoners were wounded. 1 insurgent was reported killed. When we come back, the faces in the crowd, those who came to say goodbye to the only Pope they have ever known.
Sunday, co-chairman of the Weapons
Finally, this evening, as the population of St. Peter's Square swelled to 70,000, we took note of the faces. They weren't just the faces of Romans, just the clergy. They were the faces of everyone, of the Pope, the people this Pope attracted. And he did it by combining the jet age with the media age into a kind of perfect storm that he used to spread the word, his own image, and thus his teachings. In this thoroughly modern media age, first notification of his death came via email to news organizations from the Vatican press office. And yet, for all the speed of this internet age, some of the residents of Rome tonight first learned the Pope had died the old-fashioned way, the way they have for centuries. They heard the bell atop the Vatican announcing John Paul II was no more. And that is how we leave you tonight as we leave for Rome. We'll see you from there tomorrow evening. Don't forget Katie Couric and Matt Lauer's special coverage in the morning on Today and Dateline special coverage tonight. I'm Brian Williams. Good night.
Pope John Paul II. As the world mourns his passing, NBC News looks back at his life and what's next for the Catholic Church. Watch Today, NBC Nightly News, Dateline, MSNBC, and online at msnbc.com. The Death of the Pope on NBC News.